Hello, I'm Bill Monroe, and welcome to episode 74 of 2-Minute Talk Tips. This week's tip, use checklists. One of my favorite shows on TV these days is a show called Air Disasters. And yeah, it's kind of morbid. The show highlights different disasters involving aircraft, crashes, collisions, all sorts of things like that. And in several of those crashes, human error is the reason that it happened. Expert pilots who have flown for hundreds or thousands of flights sometimes make a mistake. They may skip a crucial step or do a crucial step wrong. And that's why it is so important for pilots to have checklists. And even today, these experts, in order to prevent these crashes from happening, adhere to dozens of different checklists to ensure that mistakes don't happen. While you're speaking, you may not have hundreds of lives in your hands, but that doesn't mean you can't use checklists as well. Checklists can be a fantastic way to help make sure that you get everything done that you need to do. And you can use a variety of different checklists. You might have a couple of checklists for what to pack, so you don't accidentally leave your pants in the different city. Not that I have ever done that and then had to make a last-minute run to Walmart the morning of an event. You could also have a checklist for your presentation kit. What goes in your bag, from extension cords to gaffer's tape to spare flash drives to VGA to HDMI adapters. You can have a checklist for actions to do at the event. It's also important to have a checklist for teardown. And the teardown checklist is for how you're packing up, what you do at the very end of the event to make sure you don't leave any of your gear behind. And of course, it's important to have a follow-up checklist that you go through maybe the day or week after the event. Did you follow up with the organizer? Did you send your thank yous? Did you answer the questions that the audience members asked? Stick around. And after the break, we're going to talk about audience size and how that impacts your speaking. Welcome back. Back in high school, doing speech and debate was the first time I really encountered a huge audience. And it wasn't actually in competition. We were at the state finals in Albany, New York, and at the end of the event, several of us would get called up on stage for our awards. So we would go up there and stand on this stage in front of speech and debate teams from across New York State. And there were hundreds of people in that room. And you get up on stage and you look out and you can't see them. You can only see a few of the people, but you can't see all the way back because the lights were shining right on us. The scale in that room just made it very difficult to see the audience. And that was sort of the first time I had encountered that. One of the things that happens when we talk about speaking and talk about crowds, we often don't think about these quirks and how this impacts our experience as speakers. So that's what I want to talk about today, because audience size matters. It affects the gear that you're going to use while you speak. It affects how you prepare for your talk. It affects what you do on stage and in front of the room. And it even can affect what you wear. So let's talk about a few different sizes of crowds. These are rough numbers, and folks can certainly disagree on the details, but, it's a good guideline. For this talk, I'm going to consider a small crowd to be fewer than 15 folks. A medium crowd would be about 15 to 50 attendees. A large group is going to be 51 to 100 folks. And an auditorium-sized crowd will be more than 100 folks in the audience. So let's talk a little bit about the dynamics that are at play in these different contexts. First of all, when you're working with a small group with 15 or fewer attendees, interactivity is going to be one of the most important things that you do. And that's interactivity in terms of talking directly to folks, asking questions, but also in your nonverbals and how you speak with folks. This kind of group can be very personal. Folks are going to really notice if you're not making eye contact. They are going to value that personal connection. In fact, it's going to seem very weird to them if you don't engage them on a personal level and talk to them as individuals. If you just talk at them, they're going to be irritated. You have to acknowledge them. Everybody ultimately wants to be acknowledged, and in a small group, people actually expect it. That means your presentation can likely be, and likely ought to be, much more conversational. Time management in a group this size can also be a lot harder because there will be more questions coming at you, and folks are not going to hold their questions to the end. There's also going to be a lot more crosstalk where attendees are talking to one another and commenting on things. And yet it's still going to be so important for you to stay on time and manage your time throughout this talk, because if things go off on tangents, which is more likely, you need to make sure you're aware of where you are in your presentation so you can bring things back to the topics you want to talk about, or you're not going to get through it all. This group is actually more like a meeting that you may be attending, and in fact, often it really is just a meeting. That also means that decision-making is more likely to happen in this group, as you'll have a few key folks in the room who may be evaluating a proposal or trying to make a decision about the topic you're talking about. And so that alters how you're going to present your material and perhaps even your calls to action and your close when you ask people to go ahead and buy your product or adopt your plan or whatever it is that you're in there for. The other key thing to keep in mind is that if you are the guest here, especially if you are an outside person, you have to be aware of the group dynamics because they are going to have their own little meeting while you're standing up there in front of them. And it's helpful if you can learn more about those dynamics and more about what the attendees are looking for before you start speaking. A medium-sized crowd is going to be, again, more like 15 to 50 people. And this is less likely to be a meeting, and it's more likely to be a classroom or seminar type of event. Now, of course, when I say that, more likely, less likely, realize again, those are not absolutes. But in this type of group size, you may be teaching folks or informing folks about something. Room control starts to become more possible here because as a speaker, you start to have more authority in a room of this size. It's sort of the size of a room that we may have gone to in grade school or high school, and that teacher had automatic authority in those places, and some of those tendencies still tend to come through. They're going to look to you to drive the timing and to drive the activities and to drive what you're doing in this room. And you're going to have to be able to take on that role. This is also the size of the group where, especially if you have a full day of content or a longer session, you can start breaking the group up into smaller groups for activities. They can practice a skill or have a small discussion and then come back and speak to the group. It becomes much more likely that this type of group, you'll have longer sessions, anywhere from 45 to 90 minutes to 3 hours to all day. And it will really vary widely. But the key thing is this group, you're more likely to be in that education type of context. Once you get to the large group, more than 50 people, things start to change quite a bit. You're getting a lot more formal now. You have a much stricter plan that you're going into that talk with. You're going to be doing fewer activities. You're unlikely to be breaking up a large group of 80 people into small groups to go do something and then come back. And it just becomes a lot more hassle to try and control them. You probably don't have the flexibility of moving the furniture around as easily to do that. So you're going to be doing fewer activities. This is less about training them and more about informing them of something. Checking for understanding with your attendees as you go through your talk is a lot more difficult. You can't just look at everybody and know whether they're getting it. And you have to keep moving to respect everyone's time. You can't just slow down because a couple of members of the group are having a lot of difficulty with something. Folks are also more likely to help you control the room. So People are still going to ask questions in these groups, and sometimes you will encounter that obnoxious questioner who is just trying to play stump the speaker. That is very rare, but it does happen. When it does happen in a group of this size, the audience is more likely to be on your side and to help you shut down that obnoxious questioner. Of course, the audience is always on your side, but in terms of how aggressive they'll be with other members of the audience, they're more likely to be more aggressive with this size crowd. You're also less likely to get a decision during this session. So if you have a bunch of people in the room who have to make a decision, unless, you're in front of a council that's voting on something, this size group just is not going to make a decision based on consensus. You have to refocus your goals as you go into an audience of this size. You have less opportunity to be fluid and change all of your directions around during the talk. One of the things that's really interesting to keep in mind, though, is that you have to figure out, do you need to talk to everyone or just a few people in this room? By that I mean, are there key stakeholders or decision makers in the audience, or is everybody in the audience the actual audience for your talk? Are they all relevant, or are just a few folks relevant? You find this out by asking in advance. You need to know who those key decision makers are and ideally where they are in the crowd so that you can keep an eye on them. Now, that's not an excuse to ignore everyone else. You still have to pay attention to everybody else that's in the room and treat the whole audience with respect. But if you're looking for a key decision, if your business is dependent on what 3 or 4 or 5 people in that room happen to feel, then you need to know who they are, where they are, and what they're concerned about. These crowds can have some tricky dynamics, so it's helpful for you to understand a little bit more about the context here. Whose idea was it to bring all of these people into this room? What else are they hearing that day while you're there? Are they predisposed to value your content, to not care about your content, or to be actively opposed to your content? Most often, this type of group, there is a separate event organizer or a key contact person for this group, and you can reach out to them to start asking some of these questions to understand that context. So now let's talk about the auditorium, that 100-plus group of folks. This is what most folks think of as the big time. And once you get to about 100, that can be about the most intimidating number there is. You might think, why doesn't it get more intimidating or harder at 500 people or 1,000 people or even more? Well, for some speakers and in some contexts it does, but most of the time it doesn't matter. You see, once you get above 100 people, suddenly you can't really see the crowd. Usually there are lights pointed at the stage, the crowd can see you, and the cameras that are focused on you can put you up on the big screens. So what that means is that only the first couple of rows are going to be visible to you from the stage. The rest of it is just sort of going to fade away like that auditorium I encountered back in high school. The whole mass of people becomes a lot more generic. So one thing that can be helpful is for you to try and just pick a couple of folks that are within your field of view that you can sort of use as a proxy for how you're doing for the rest of the event. But don't only look down at them. You want to make sure that you also look out into the distance towards that collection of faces you can't really see so that they think you're looking at them too and acknowledging them too. One thing that's more likely to be different here too when you get into these auditorium-sized crowds is that there's likely to be more infrastructure at play that you need to be aware of. You're more likely to have an AV team, an audio-video team, working with you. So you need to think about your slides. You're probably not going to be driving your slides from a computer connected to a projector on a table next to you. You might, but the bigger the crowd is, the more likely somebody else will be driving your slides from the back of the room. And they may be doing it on their own machine or in different software. So you need to ask about AV needs ahead of time. You're also more likely to have a microphone. For a crowd of 100 or more people, you really do need amplification. Yes, I know you're very loud, but If you don't have amplification, those people in the back of the room are just going to have a hard time hearing you. They might get 90% of what you say, and it's just really tiring to try and constantly figure out exactly what the speaker is saying and fill in those blanks. So you're more likely to have a mic. You might not even have a choice in this. And that's going to affect your choice of wardrobe. If you have a lavalier mic or a clip-on mic, is there someplace on your shirt, on your collar, or on your jacket that microphone can be clipped to? Will the clothing that you wear rub against the microphone while you're speaking, creating annoying sounds? And a lot of times those microphones will have a battery pack and transmitter, and that will probably need to hang on the back of your belt or go in a pocket. So you need to make sure that your clothing can accommodate this. As a general rule, men have less of an issue with this because have ready access to pockets, but this can be a challenge, especially for folks who are wearing women's clothing, who may be wearing a dress, and you need to make sure that you can accommodate a radio pack. You're also more likely to have a confidence monitor for this type of presentation. And since your slides are probably being projected behind you, a confidence monitor is usually one that sits at the foot of the stage or right in front of the stage that only the speakers can see. And that shows you your slides or a preview of your next slide. So you need to make sure you have a chance to work with that and understand what you're going to be seeing on that monitor. Is it showing you exactly what's happening behind you, or is it showing you speaker notes and what you'll see next? You want to figure that out in advance. Also, you need to know where you stand on the stage. You really don't want to be pacing back and forth on a large stage because it becomes very distracting for the audience. The lighting techs are trying to keep the light on you, so that can be very difficult. And there may be certain spots on the stage that are not friendly to your microphone, and you may actually start encountering feedback. So you want to ask ahead of time, are there good or bad places for you to stand on the stage? And if you move from one spot to another, make sure you're doing it deliberately and not just by habit. Your speech timing is also going to be more critical in this type of environment. There are lots of resources committed here. Lots of folks, lots of labor hours are being spent by people in that audience listening to you. So you have to be even more respectful of your time. Do not go overtime. If you go overtime, you're impacting other speakers and can potentially put an entire event behind schedule. If you don't often work with this type of crowd, you also have to think about the humorous moments that are in your talk. Think about how the crowd is going to laugh, because you want to give them time to laugh at your jokes and at your humorous moments if they do respond that way. And these laughs can actually go on a little bit longer than they do in front of smaller crowds. So there are a number of different things to keep in mind, but the key is you're just not going to be able to see hundreds of people at a time. It just doesn't usually work that way. With a talk like this, you're also really not going to have time to go ahead and pause and center yourself on stage at the beginning of your talk. So have your intro memorized and be ready to dive in and go. So what does all this mean? Well, in my estimation, medium and large crowds can often be the most intimidating, especially if you're not as well prepared. But the most important thing is to know your audience size in advance so that you can prepare. Don't prep a whole bunch of small group activities for an auditorium-sized crowd. And don't bring a strictly scripted talk to a small group. Always ask yourself ahead of time, why am I speaking with this group? What is my goal? What can I do with this size crowd? Am I talking to everyone or just a subset of them? How will I define success? And how will they define success? When you know all this, you can go in with your eyes wide open. You can adjust your content and speaking plan as appropriate and bring the right size talk to the right size crowd. So what's the toughest crowd size for you? How do you adjust to different group sizes? Let us know in the comments over at 2minutetalktips.com/crowd size. Make a habit of building checklists around your talks. Subscribe to 2-Minute Talk Tips in your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. And, of course, as always, don't get best, get better. Thanks a lot. I'm Bill Monroe, and I'll talk to you next week.
2-Minute Talk Tips is a proud production of the Currently Speaking Podcast Network.